In my last video, I was complaining about receiving latency from my hardware, routing the audio from live to my screen capture software, and when I press buttons on the push, there'd be a few milliseconds of delay before hearing it, which is really frustrating when you're trying to demonstrate how good something works. I've just cracked the issue. I'm now recording my audio externally from my Tascam recorder here, and I sort of feel like I still have my YouTube training wheels on. You know, these content creators are pumping out videos like weekly or bi-weekly. I don't know how they do it. There's so much work involved with the multi-camera angles and screen capture software and getting good audio and making sure the lighting is right, the pre and post-production. It's a lot of work, but I'm getting there. I'm getting better. Anyway, let's get stuck into the video today. I think you're really going to like it. It's a good one. So I'm just working on a new track at the moment. It's in its early experimental, let the ideas flow out and see what sticks stage. Not too sure if this is the final direction of the track, but I'm pretty happy with it so far. Got a nice good groove going, got some nice chords, some sweet little piano parts in there too. I'll just play you the track real quickly so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. So just a pretty simple 8-bar loop there. Is it 8 bars? 8 bars, yeah. Now I've reached a stage where I'd like to incorporate some of my analog gear. I've got a few analog synths here in the studio. Generally speaking, when I start adding my analog gear into my existing track, things just take a whole new direction and it really starts to bring things alive. I'm already running my TR-8. It's providing the kick and the clap and some of the hi-hats already. I've done a previous video already on how I rigged up my TR-8 to Ableton Live and also sequencing it on the push. If you'd like to go and check that video out. The response to that video has been really good so far. I've had many people download my free drum rack from my website. So I thought we'd continue things in a similar vein and show you how we can incorporate an analog synth into Ableton Live and also how we can incorporate the Ableton Push into the setup. For this example, I'm going to be using the Moog Mother 32 semi-modular analog synthesizer, a beautiful synth that really doesn't need a lot of tweaking to get some amazing sounds out of it. I've explored this synth to about 5% of its capabilities. As soon as I unboxed it, plugged it in and started messing with it, my mind was just blown with how beautiful this synth sounds. It's probably one of the best purchases I've ever made. So firstly, let's take a look at my hardware setup here. I have the Ableton Push plugged into my computer via the USB cable, and I also have the power cable plugged in here. Then from my audio interface, which is sitting just off camera here, I have a 5-pin MIDI cable, which looks a little something like this, from the MIDI out port of my interface to the MIDI in port of the Mother 32. I'm then running an audio cable or a TRS cable, like one of these, from the main outs on the Mother 32 to one of the inputs on my audio interface. This is a really typical setup for any piece of analog gear where we're sending MIDI from our interface to our piece of gear and then sending the audio back into our interface, and we're creating that communication loop. I actually like to run multiple pieces of analog gear together, so I actually have the Roland TR-8 and the Moog Mother 32 MIDI daisy chained together. My actual setup, I have a MIDI cable running from my interface into my TR-8, and then I'm running MIDI out of the TR-8 into the Moog Mother 32. On the Mother 32, we only have a single MIDI in port. There's no MIDI out. So this kind of has to be at the end of the chain. However, on my slim Phatty over here, which I use the same setup, we have MIDI in, we have MIDI out, and MIDI through. Now that we've set up our hardware, we can jump over to Ableton Live and take a look at Live's preferences. So under the audio tab in preferences, we want to head over to our input device and make sure that we have our interface selected. I'm using the Scarlet 18i8 as my interface, so I'm going to select that guy. I'm also selecting my output as my interface as well. And we can also head over to our input configuration. And this is quite cool because we can actually label the various inputs of our different devices. You can see here I have my SM7B, which is my microphone. I also have my Slim Phatty channel, my Mother 32 channel, my TR-8 channel, and I also just recently got the Minilogue XD, which is on channel 7 and 8. I generally like to keep the inputs off that I'm not using. I only keep 1 and 2 open here for some external instruments like a guitar or a bass guitar or something like that. Now, for most of you, I'm sure your interface is already set up, so let's head down to the Link and MIDI tab here. Now, all we want to enable here is the track MIDI output for our audio interface. If this wasn't enabled, then we wouldn't be able to send MIDI from Live's MIDI tracks, which is exactly what we want to do. If you're wanting to send MIDI clock to your piece of hardware, then you could enable the sync MIDI output also. But for this example and the synthesizer that I'm using, which has a built-in sequencer, if I enable the MIDI clock, it actually launches a sequencer every time I press play in Live. It's actually super annoying. So I actually disable clock on this because I just want to send MIDI to it. Once we've done those couple of steps, we can close Live's preferences and we can take a look at how we set this up in one of Live's MIDI tracks. So I have a MIDI track here all ready to go. It's labeled Mother 32 to keep things nice and tidy. And I have an external instrument device loaded in here. If you don't know how to find this, then we just go up to our browser under categories and you'll find the external instrument device there. Just drag this baby down into a MIDI track. So this is where we're going to be creating that information loop that we talked about earlier. We want to send MIDI to our audio interface. In this instance, I'm using the Scarlet 18i8, so I'm going to select that guy. Now, by default, the Mother 32 receives MIDI via MIDI channel 1. So we have 16 different options here. This is how MIDI works. We have 16 channels of MIDI data that we can send. Depending on your piece of gear, it will have a default MIDI setting. I know that the Mother 32 defaults to MIDI channel 1. Your synth could be different. You can go into the device settings and you can actually change this really easily. You'll just have to look up the MIDI implementation charts, which you'll generally find in your piece of gear's manual. So we've set up our MIDI send. We're sending to the audio interface. We're sending to channel 1. Now we just need to select where that audio is going to be received from. Where is the Moog plugged in? Well, for me, it's plugged into channel number 5. I know because it's nicely labeled here, which I set up in my audio input preferences. You can see my microphone input here, which is on channel number 3, but the Mother 32 is plugged in on channel number 5, so I'm going to select that. Now, as for the output of the Mother 32, I have my volume maxed out here all the way to make sure that I'm getting the most out of this synthesizer before it reaches live. We do have a gain dial here. If your synth is maxed out and you're still not getting enough power from it, then we can crank up the gain if we need to. We can also monitor the input using the peak meter here. If your synth is running a bit too hot, you might need to back that off a little bit. All right, so we've set up our MIDI, we've set up our audio, push is turned on. We're now getting sound from our analog synth. We're going to bring this to life in a minute with some audio processing. But before we dive into audio effects, I just wanted to take a minute to tackle any latency issues that may come up. One of the best things that we can do to tackle latency is to decrease our buffer size. If we head over to Live's preferences, there is a whole section here on latency under the audio tab. The thing we're really concerned about here is this drop-down menu here where we can select our buffer size samples. For me, on my setup, I find that 128 samples works pretty well. If I go any lower than that, I find that it puts a little bit too much strain on my CPU. My computer just can't handle it. 128 samples is significantly lower than most setups. I believe by default, Ableton Live is set to 512 samples, and you can see our overall latency down here is 26 milliseconds. As I decrease this, let's go to 256, we've come down to 15 milliseconds, 128, 10 milliseconds. Now if I go all the way down to 32, we've I've got 7 milliseconds. Now, the difference between 128 and 32 is the difference of 3 milliseconds. So I tend to keep this on 128 samples, which does pretty good for my setup. I really can't notice the difference. Now, 10 milliseconds of latency is an acceptable amount for myself. It's pretty hard to distinguish that latency, especially for an analog synthesizer, but there is an extra step that we can do depending on how anal you are with this stuff and how precise you want to get this. We actually have a hardware latency slider within our external instrument. Here we can actually compensate for any latency that we may be experiencing. So there's two methods that we can use to take this a step further, and one is to create some MIDI and play that alongside our metronome and see if we can audibly hear that latency. The other method would be to record our MIDI, and then if we can actually visually see that latency. So let's run through these two tests together. Firstly, I'm just going to create a MIDI clip up here, and we'll put in a note, C2. Seems like a pretty good note to start with. And I'm just going to duplicate this across onto every downbeat. Now I'm going to switch on my metronome, and we're just going to play this and see if we can hear the latency, and we can mess around with the hardware latency slider here to see if we can dial this in, almost like we're DJing with the synthesizer and the metronome, and we're like beat syncing these together. So let's have a listen. Let's try adjusting this dial. Now, this is very, very subjective, but I think somewhere around 7 or so milliseconds sounds pretty bang on to me. Let's try out the other method though. Let's try recording this signal and see how we go with that. So let's just insert an audio track here, and I'm going to take the audio from the Mother 32. Let's just leave monitoring off. Let's arm this track, and we'll turn the metronome off. We don't need that anymore. Let's actually bring the hardware latency back to 0, and let's just record this note. And if we zoom in on this, let's have a look at this note. We're actually sitting pretty close to the downbeat here. If we highlight this, we can actually really have a look down in the bottom right hand corner of live. We can see we have about, what's that, 2 milliseconds worth of latency. So we're actually sitting pretty good. So let's go back to our latency dial here. Let's maybe put in 2 milliseconds. Let's delete this guy and let's record this again. All right, let's have a look now with the 2 milliseconds latency control, and we're pretty bang on there. This is within a fraction. It's not even coming up how big this difference is. So I think we've pretty much nailed it. So those are the two methods. You can first try dialing it in by ear to see if you can hear that latency. But the most accurate test would be to actually record that audio to see what that actually looks like. And then you can adjust your latency settings within the external instrument device. All right, I'm going to delete this audio track. We no longer need that. It's time to start getting into the musical side of things. This was quite a little bit of setup and tricky to explain, but once you get into the hang of doing this stuff, it actually is very, very quick and very easy to just route a little bit of external gear into live. So some of the effects that I've got going on here. First effect that I have here is the tuner device. Now, this is super helpful when dealing with analog gear, especially this synthesizer. I have a frequency dial up here. This synthesizer can vary in its tuning. Just like a guitar, you've got the pegs where you can tune your guitar strings. They'll slip out of tune. Same thing happens with analog synthesizers. For this guy, the Mother 32, it seems to stay pretty well in tune. I do find when I take it out on stage that depending on my environment, maybe if the club is very cold or maybe the club is very hot and humid, it will actually affect the tuning of the synth. So let's just play a single note here. Looks like we're a little bit sharp of C. I'll show you just moving the frequency dial around. So we're sitting pretty close there. The tuner device is absolutely fantastic for this. Next up, we have a saturator device. Now, saturator I absolutely love. I tend to put saturator on pretty much every one of my external instruments. Just adds a little bit of warmth, adds a little bit of dirt. After saturator, I have a delay. This is going to really sort of start bringing things to life. All right, moving on from there, I have some reverb. This is really going to bring it to life as well. And finally, on my effects processing here, I just have the Nicky Romero Kickstart plugin. Very, very handy, very simple plugin, just a basic sidechain so that we've got a bit of a pulsating effect. Let's actually just play my track here, and I'm just going to mess around with some ideas and just sort of see if something comes out. Let's go up an octave. Nice, definitely something in there. Let's actually record an 8-bar loop so that it matches up with the chords. Turn fixed length on, and let's just record an idea, see how we go. All right, beautiful. Yeah, liking that idea. So I've got one idea. Let's bank that down here. I want to record another idea as well, or just show you another technique that we can use with the push. Let's try with the Max for Live arpeggiator. I have that loaded in here on the side. Let's just enable this. I've got a little pattern that I've punched in here, which is just a little rhythmical idea I kind of liked. But I might change up the sound a little bit on my Mother 32. So I'm going to bring the sustain off. Let's bring up the filter envelope. Bring up the decay time. Get some nice plucky sounds. Bring the octave down. Now I think the chords, sits somewhere in there, so we can just play around with the chord pattern. But if we stay in scale, we can really just hit any note and it's going to sound pretty good. So let's just mess around with some ideas there. That's pretty cool. I like that quite a lot, actually. What we can do is maybe we can record one of these ideas where I'm just kind of messing around with the pads, and then I'll show you one more trick as well. All right, so we're going to go that same 8-bar loop, and let's just record something. So let's bank this idea also. I'm just going to switch off the arpeggiator here because I want to take a look at some of the advanced features on the Push 2, like the Melodic step sequencer. This is really cool if we want to just punch in those notes manually. We just need to make sure that we're sticking to the scale. I'm going to jump out of chromatic mode here and just go into in key mode. So now any note that I punch in here is going to be within our scale. Now for the Melodic step sequencer, I like to sequence in 16th notes, but we only have 8 visible slots here. So the sequence is going to be moving along very quickly. So we might limit this to a shorter loop length. Let's just say 1 bar for now to keep things nice and simple. That means that the pads will only refresh twice. Now, if we hold down the layout button whilst we're in the Melodic step sequencer mode, we can actually create our MIDI clip. If we have fixed length enabled, we're on 1 bar, and we select the very top left pad. That's going to create our MIDI clip for us. And you can see the Melodic step sequencer going by. Is the first half of the loop, second half of the loop. Now we can choose to focus on, say, the first half of the loop. Now we've just got a half bar loop going back and forth, and we can input some notes in here. Okay, we're very low. Let's go up a few octaves here. Let's try this. I'm going to turn the accent on so we're getting full velocity here as well. Now, to give us a bit of context, maybe I'll play our pianos so that we can have something melodic to play along with. Sounds pretty cool. Let's go to the second half of the loop and see if we can add something in here. Okay, and let's listen to the two together. That's cool. All right, so it's getting totally carried away there, but I can see why it was worthwhile making this video because it's kind of sparked that inspiration in me. And I think that's what it's all about. It's kind of like breaking out of the box and exploring other dimensions rather than just being stuck in the digital world. That's the beautiful thing about Ableton Live and the accessibility of like really cheap analog synth these days. I highly recommend just having one little sound module that sits on your desk, and when the mood is right, giving that baby a little bit of a spin and seeing if you can incorporate it into your own tracks. So I do hope that this video has inspired you in some way, and if you do have an old synth collecting dust on the shelf that you're inspired to incorporate that into your setup in some way. If you did like this video, then please remember to subscribe. It really does help, and remember to give this video a thumbs up also. Until next time, keep creating. Bye for now.